my thoughts and in my dreams, they're always in my mind. These songs of hobbits, dwarves and men, and elves, come close your eyes, you can see them too.
Hey, so I promised a little while back that I would tell you a story, I think in a video and on Twitter, about one of my old RPG sessions, one of the old days when I used to play a lot more RPGs and I worked in a game store. I was actually starting to write a book about it, or at least some kind of like I made a blog that I was eventually going to kind of adapt, and it was called Counter Monkey, and it was going to be kind of a collection of my funniest RPG stories, and I was actually going to make it kind of collaborative, where people would send me their own funny RPG stories, and I would kind of amalgamate it into a book, and maybe that would be funny. And the reason it was called Counter Monkey was because when I worked at the store and I worked behind the counter, that's what we would call people, and there were always people who would go up to the counter and they would go to the store, go up to the counter and have no other agenda except to tell people RPG stories, or how cool their character is, or you know, the latest party wipe that happened, or, you know, how they died, or how they really did something epic, or how they swear they got 3 straight 18s on their character and they really rolled 3d6, you know, and they would spend hours doing this. And so I listened to so many character stories and eventually just learned to tune it out. And so that was the book I was making, was me telling my own funny RPG stories. And I got about like 5 stories before I realized those were pretty much my best ones. I didn't really have any more, but I just remembered a really good one. And it's called The Squirt Gun Wars. And this game has to do with Shadowrun. And if you don't know what Shadowrun is, the closest thing I can think of that would give you an idea is if you ever saw the movie Johnny Mnemonic. It's a little like that, where you have, it's kind of a dystopian cyberpunk future where people can graft machine parts into them to make them more than human, or like actually more like Deus Ex Human Revolution, if you saw that, where people replace body parts with augmentations, or that, so like they can add blades to their arms, or they can replace their eyes with eyes that can see in the dark, or even shoot bullets, you know, things like that. And that is one of the great joys of Shadowrun, really, is the shopping. If you love shopping, Shadowrun is the perfect game, or it was. I haven't played it in a long time. There's new editions, actually. The latest edition of Shadowrun really radically redesigned the core fundamentals of Shadowrun, because it involved the Matrix. And the Matrix isn't what you think of in the movie The Matrix. The Matrix was the internet, before we really had an internet. And so, you know, back before we had the internet, our vision of the internet is different from what the internet is now. And so what they did now was, the early editions of Shadowrun didn't really take into account the possibilities of wireless communication, so that's why the new edition kind of dispenses a lot of the old taboos of literally plugging your head into the Matrix. Everyone's kind of ubiquitously connected to the Matrix, so you can see an augmented reality, which is actually something that's really groundbreaking today, is augmented reality, where the best example of augmented reality is if you have, there's like Android apps where you can look through the camera of your Android and see notes that people have left on the street. That's kind of an example of augmented reality, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of what the new Matrix is. But I played first and second edition Shadowrun before we kind of got out of it in third edition. But this was back in the day when shopping was so cool in Shadowrun, and not only did you have just hundreds and hundreds of weapons and pieces of cyber technology in the core book, but there were splat books. There were accessory books that were like 100 pages, 120 pages of nothing but new gear. And there was like the Neo-Anarchist Guide to Real Life. I keep crossing it up with Cyberpunk. There was another game like it called Cyberpunk that was even older. Shadowtech. I can't even remember all of them, but I had a lot of them. I had all of them, and I looked everywhere. I didn't throw out any of my books, and I looked everywhere for these old Shadowrun books, and I couldn't find the one I needed, because I swear it was in the Shadowtech book, and I couldn't find it, because Shadowtech was like the coolest fucking book ever. So you would spend days we would sit at the store for days, just flipping through books, being as creative as fucking possible, creating these cybered up thieves or hitmen or whatever, you know, trying to find new and exciting combinations. It was so much fun. It was like character blender, you know, you just threw all this shit in a blender and saw what shook out. And you had to, there was a limit on how much cyber tech you could put in your character. You had 6 points of essence, and every piece of cyber technology took away essence. And so you had to balance it out to where you couldn't go below 0, but at this time we didn't really roleplay the effects of having like really, really low essence. We just weren't, we didn't have that much experience. We were just kind of playing for fun, and we weren't really heavy into role playing. Really, strictly speaking, if, you know, we had Street Samurai with like sub 1, or like, we would run these guys right up to the edge of having like 0. Actually, the golden number was, the rules, you couldn't go below 0. Otherwise you would die, essentially. But you could go to 0. And that would essentially, in role-playing terms, that means you're essentially the Terminator. You know, like you have no humanity left. That's literally what it means, is you have no humanity left. You are cold, emotionless, you are a machine. So we never really role-played the effects of having less and less and less and less essence. Mainly because I don't think people were really that interested. We just wanted to kill stuff. And so that was the joy of shopping, was kind of finding ways to break the system or really aggravate the DM. And so that was the big thing with cybertech and finding Street Samurai. You know, the big thing for a while used to be getting wired reflexes and getting like 4 attacks per round, and you know, having like hand blades and shit, like being Wolverine. Everyone always wanted to create a character who wore a trench coat, would dual wield katanas, and had like wired reflexes 3, which made you essentially like Agent Smith with katanas. You know, you were like super fast. You could almost literally dodge bullets with that kind of reflexes. You were so fast, you know. Basically what it did was it replaced your spinal cord with a fiber optic cable. So, you know, your reflexes were about the speed of light. It was that cool. So shopping was really, really awesome. And so we'd spend days flipping through these books and just buying stuff. Everything you could think of that you could possibly want to put in your body in terms of like cyberware. If you wanted to grab the fucking chainsaw on your arm, Cyberpunk did that. Cyberpunk actually had like the chainsaw arm. And it was really not that good, but if you wanted a fucking chainsaw on your arm, you could do it. But Shadowrun, you could do Wolverine claws, you could do like, I remember one guy, we actually did like a batleth. They were called like spurs. You could have like a batleth shoot out of your arm, and we would fight like that. We had a guy who had like a blade shoot out of his feet, and he would be like a taekwondo expert, and he had robot feet that were super fast. He could kick, he could jump real high. You know, guys of course with bulletproof skin, guys who could turn their hands into like mega busters, who could turn everything you could think of. You could do with this. I'm playing with Oreo. So the point I'm trying to establish is we had all these books, and they had all this equipment in it. And so not only did they have cyber technology, they had new guns and new ammo and new pieces of equipment you could flip around, and, you know, cloaking devices you could wear, and shades that could link into your hand, smart gun, smart link, where you had like, your gun would have a wireless wire connection that would go up your arm to your eyeball, and you would see crosshairs in your eyeball linked directly up to your gun, and so everyone had that. I remember one bit of thing that kind of broke the game at one point was they started establishing Delta grade cyberware, which is essentially like military grade or Black Ops grade cyberware, which didn't take away as much essence, but it cost a lot more. So people were trying to get as much Deltaware cyberware as possible. So they were spamming out their characters to get like contacts in the military, so they could justify getting Delta grade cyberware, and loading themselves with a ludicrous amount of cyber. And that was always the demand for like doing jobs. They didn't want money anymore. They were trying to vector for Delta grade cyberware. I remember BioWare was something that was that really broke the game for a while. Or no, that was Adepts. I hated fucking Adepts. Adepts were like basically there was cyber technology and there was magic, and they didn't mix. You couldn't have cyber technology and magic. You could, but your magic greatly suffered if you put cyber technology in yourself. So eventually what they did were called like kind of like half mages, which were called adepts. And what adepts were is they didn't have full magic, but they had magic that augment a certain part of their body. So for instance, you would have an adept called like a physical adept. who essentially were like Shaolin monks from the movies. And so these physical adepts were super, super special. They had like physical chi. And so you would have guys who were magically really, really fast in reflexes, or guys who were magically resistant to bullets, or guys who could summon like a ki blast from their fist and like fucking punch through a wall. You know, it was kind of like having a street samurai without the cyber technology, and I fucking hated them because they didn't have to pay for their shit. They never ran out of ammo, and they never really suffered for their art. You know what I mean? Like, a street samurai really had to make some sacrifices, but not so much with adepts. They had some drawbacks, of course, but I always hated the adepts. They would do this thing where like they had the one guy I hated had really good reflexes, and he had what I think it was called killing hands. And so his killing hands could like cut through armor. He had like his hands turned into swords or some shit, and so he could like fucking punch a guy's heart out, and it didn't fucking matter, you know. And like not even Street Samurai had that shit, and so it really bugged me. Man, my camera just white balanced the fuck out of this. Anyway, so when we were shopping, the Shadowtech book came out, and I'm finally getting started with the story of the Squirt Gun Wars. And a few of you, I know Mike Dodd, actually, as soon as I brought up the Squirt Gun Wars, he knew immediately what I was talking about because he said DMSO. And there was a section in Shadowtech, I think it was Shadowtech, called drugs. So there was a whole list of drugs that you could take, and they would either augment your ability or they were like poisonous. So you could poison people with the drugs. And I'm not paying attention to her, and she's going nuts. Hey, you want to get your ball? Look. Woo! She'll come back. Anyway, so there was a bunch of drugs in there, and there was one in particular called DMSO. And I don't know what it stands for. It's like dimethyl something. So there she is. And it was really interesting because what it did was it had no effect by itself, or it had very little effect by itself. But what it did was if you splashed it on somebody, it would allow for drugs to be absorbed through any skin tissue that had DMSO on it. So most drugs have to be injected, like, you know, or ingested or something like that. So what DMSO did was if you combined it with another substance, you could splash it on them and it would be absorbed through the skin. So then it didn't even take much imagination to start to realize the damage you could do with this. So what people would do was they actually started buying squirt guns. And they would buy squirt guns, and they would buy like industrial strength fucking quantities of DMSO and other drugs. And they would mix it up in the squirt gun and spray it on people. And so the first thing they started with was called neurostun, which I think was also in the book. So neurostun basically like locked up your nervous system or some shit. And so when they sprayed it on people, it also had the effect of what was cool about DMSO, another thing that was cool about it, was that armor had basically no effect. It said in the book, and I'm remembering here, if you had any kind of porous armor that was made of like a fabric, or like Kevlar, or any kind of armor essentially, the armor had no effect. You got no resistance. It was basically like a ranged touch attack. So if you got squirted, you were hit. But if you had hard armor, like if you actually had like Terminator fucking armor, like steel plates or some kind of like suit, you know, if you had like an armored RoboCop suit, it had effect, but it only had half effect. So even if you had armor, it was only half as effective. So, she's still playing. So all of a sudden, this revolutionized the entire history of Shadowrun warfare, where they started playing with neurostun, but then they started getting sadistic. Neurostun took too long. So then they started getting like other drugs. There was some kind of like there was like something called Doom, like a Doom virus. They would load shit up with Doom and fuck, what is it? Not strychnine, arsenic. They would load their shit up with arsenic and DMSO and spray it on a dude's face. And the armor had no effect, and it would immediately absorb through the skin and kill them within seconds. So all of a sudden I was starting to research the fatal effects of being injected with like however much dosage of arsenic would hit you with, because as soon as you were hit with that shit, you were dead. You were so dead. And so all of a sudden these guys were neuro-stunning the shit out of any kind of corporate resistance they were running in, and all of a sudden they were just cakewalking through everything. And so, again, this is when I was just starting as a DM, so I wasn't thinking about certain things, but it made me start thinking about certain things like how, strictly speaking, how legal is this stuff? How legal is DMSO? Or how are they getting a hold of essentially military-grade shit like neurostun or arsenic or Doom, like the Doom virus. And so I started going like, well, and then you start asking the questions like, how are they legally getting access to fucking Wolverine blades and gun links and Delta grade cyberware? And so all of a sudden I started house ruling shit. I was like, I had to take control of this. They were just killing everybody with squirt guns. They would all load up with fucking super soakers, load in their car, drive over to shit, and start squirt gunning people to death. It was fucking embarrassing. So like, I got to get control of this. And so I told him, I was like, look, I'm going to start taking into account the legality codes. Like everything had a legality code where, depending on how legal it was harder to get or more expensive. And so I was like, I'm going to start cracking down on some of this shit. You just can't get, I started saying like, you just can't get this shit. It's kind of military grade stuff. And I think I was kind of lying. I think in the book it really wasn't that hard to get a hold of, but I'm like, it's harder now. Because of the massacres going on in corporate facilities, the law's cracking down. You can't get DMSO anymore. It's for medical use only. And so I was like, you can't get this fucking Doom virus. You can't get neurostun. That's police issue. This is the kind of stuff you just can't get a hold of. And so they're like, okay. So what they started doing was they started planning their own missions to get DMSO. They started going into business for themselves. They would go off mission. They would go off the reservation, as it were. They would they wouldn't listen to adventure hooks. They would be like, no, fuck you. We're getting DMSO, and we're gonna plot our own crimes to get this shit. So the first thing I said was that you can't get DMSO. It's for medical use only. And so they started planning ops to hit. At first, they called in fake 911 calls. And then they would hit ambulances and raid them for drugs. So I was like, okay, it's medical use only. So they would attack ambulances. They would attack the dock wagon ambulances and hit one and steal everything they had and then run off. Which is actually not as easy as you would think, because dock wagon actually has a fair amount of security. But they would hit them anyway and then steal their shit. And so I was like, okay, fair enough, you earned it. But now you're wanted criminals, congratulations. And they're like, we were wanted criminals anyway. So they were still loading their shit up with DMSO, but then they had the problem of what do we load it with? And so they go, well, they still had a lot of neurostun, because I wasn't going to take away the store they had, but they had a lot of it. But they were like, we need to plan for what we do when we run out. And they started planning hits on police stations or like or cop cars, and so they were considered calling in 911 calls and hitting cop cars. And then they thought that was kind of stupid. They were even kind of reluctant for that, but still, one guy was really, really gung-ho to do it. I think he tried it, and he got run off. But so then they started getting the idea of, one of the guys died and he made a character. This is the way these guys think. He made a character that was basically a paramedic. And so he's like, I work for Dockwagon. I Shadowrun. I moonlight as a Shadowrunner. I moonlight as this criminal who takes corporate contracts, and I moonlight as a hitman. But I work for Dockwagon. I'm a paramedic in the daytime. So all of a sudden, he was coming up with heists at the hospital to steal medical-grade shit. So he started finding an end-around way so he wouldn't get like, I think that was when he started doing arsenic. was like he was finding ways to get arsenic, or he was looking up in like medical textbooks shit that would kill you virtually instantly if you injected somebody with it. Like I think they actually started going like illegal drugs, like there was some kind of new version of cocaine that was just, like, sadistic, and so if you shot them with cocaine, all of a sudden you had these guys who couldn't hit anything anyway because they were so high. Or like I want to say nitroglycerin, but that's not it. Some kind of like heart medication that essentially just electrocuted you with it made your heart explode, or speed or some shit. And he started coming up with stuff that would just kill you outright if you were injected with it. Just, you know, medical stuff that you inject on very controlled quantities, but if you hit somebody with a fucking super soaker load of it, would not be good news. So, I mean, they started, God, I can't remember what it was. What kind of, I'm sure a doctor out there knows, like, if you injected a syringe worth of shit in there, you were dead almost instantly. But this was, he started like framing his fellow paramedics for thefts of DMSO and these hardcore drugs that he was looting, and or he'd falsify paperwork. You know, he had like forgery skills, and he was really well thought out. And so of course this character is introduced to the group, and they're like, "Hey, you're a paramedic? Do you have DMSO?" And he's like, "Yes, I do." And he sells them this shit. He's got suitcases full of it. I'm like, "You motherfuckers." And so of course there's another guy who works as corporate security, and he's smuggling neurostun. These fuckers are like trying to find every end around way they can to load their fucking super soakers because they worked so good. You know, it penetrated armor, no problem. So I'm like, fuck, what do I do? Instead of just banning them outright, which is probably what I should have done, I played along with it, and so like these guys are just fucking my shit up. Did you break that thing already? She broke her squeaky toy. She took the squeaker out of the squeaky toy. You dumbass. So, I'm like, well, if they're gonna do this, if you can't beat them, so all of a sudden, they start doing this thing where they take another job. They're so happy. They got their paramedic, they got their security guy, and they've got drug sources. They're hooked up, so they're loading up with their super soakers. They even paint them black. There's actually like military grade. In one of the books, there's actually like an actual military grade super soaker that had like long range. But I banned that. I was like, no, you can't get that. That's Black Ops. You can't have that. So they're like, okay, well, we'll just get store-bought super soakers within 30 feet or so. It should be fine. And so, you know, most engagements took place within 30 feet. And so the first thing I did was I started planting snipers. I started throwing snipers all over the place. And so I started stretching the engagements out to where guys, you know, you couldn't get close, or there were like turrets, or I started doing automated defenses. I started doing like, they would release like cyber dogs that would run up, and they were dogs that were made of robots, and so they would run up and eat people, and all of a sudden their guns wouldn't have any effect. And so that made them branch out a little bit, but I still had to eventually deal with the human element, and so eventually there were human guards at some point. So I was starting to find ways to combat this, but it kind of became like an arms race. It became me versus them. So I would come up with something, and then they would come up with something, and so it was like that. And so eventually they would have like backup weapons to deal with the doggies, but you know, eventually there was a guy running the doggies, or there was like a rigger or something like that. And so what eventually I ended up doing was I really Pearl Harbored them one day when they started dealing with the dog. Oh, look at this, you're sweet. What I did was they ran into a building and they started engaging the security guards. And all of a sudden, the security guards were in like level 2 biohazard suits that were completely sealed. They were like, you know, like if you saw Contagion or like Outbreak, they have like these rubber suits on, basically. And so this was like my big coup. I had planned this shit out. I was sick of their bullshit. I was like, I'm gonna fucking kill these guys. I wasn't even playing around. They were ruining my game for like a month. So I was like, it was personal for me. So all of a sudden they round the corner and they see like 6 guys, all in these biohazard suits, completely sealed. I'm like, these are made of rubber. I don't care what the rules say. These guys are sealed. And then these guys started busting out the squirt guns loaded with fucking neurostun and fucking Ebola or whatever the shit was that they were doing that was like fucking lethal kill. And all of a sudden, the paramedic eats 3 squirt guns full of PCP fucking right to the face. And I'm like, roll your constitution save, motherfucker, 3 times. Here's a hint, you ain't gonna make it. And all of a sudden, like, 3 of the guys die in the first round, and the 3 of the guys are instantly just KO'd because of squirt guns. And they're horrified by this. They're like, what the fuck, you son of a bitch. That's only we're supposed to play with the squirt guns. I'm like, no, it's on, bitch. Like we're fully in the grip of, this is Thunderdome, okay? Like, for a month you guys have been running roughshod with fucking squirt guns. The corporate guys, they unionized, and they got fucking squirt guns too. So all of a sudden these guys were completely unprepared for the for facing guys with squirt guns, and all of a sudden they retreat. They get the fuck out of there because they're like, they have squirt guns, flee! And so they ran to their car, and they're getting pursued by motherfuckers with squirt guns, and so they're like, we need to get rubber suits. And so they're like, where do we go? We gotta get fucking rubber suits. And so they're like, I don't know. So they're like, we need to finish the mission. So what are you doing? They start getting garbage bags, and they start like duct taping garbage bags all over themselves. And they're like, this'll work. You can't shoot through a garbage bag. Would you stop biting me? You're so excited. She wants to play, and she gets bitey when she wants to play. Where's your ball? Where's your ball? You know where your ball is? You don't know where your ball is. So they cover themselves with garbage bags. There's like 4 of them left at this point, and they start. This actually was not a bad idea. So all of a sudden we've got these guys. We've got these 4 guys covered in garbage bags. We've got like 6 guys in biohazard suits, and they're fucking in a. They're in a super soaker. Sorry, they're in a super soaker war. But the problem is, whereas these guys weren't prepared for any engagement anymore, virtually no engagement anymore that didn't involve squirt guns, the corporate security guys, in fact, were. So the corporate security guys just had sidearms. They had just like 9mm guns, but it was way more than what these guys had. So I don't think I'd introduced the dogs yet. Yeah, so there was no dogs yet, but I completely cooed them with the, would you stop biting me? Ow! But yeah, the Super Soaker guys, that was like their greatest defeat ever. What was this? And so all of a sudden they were getting shot with 9mm, and their trash bags were useless. You are so bitey today. Hang on. I'm gonna get rid of you. Here, throw, catch. So, so they pretty much got wiped by the Super Soaker guards. But this was not the end of it. They were not willing to admit defeat. So they started diversifying. They're like, okay. As soon as they all rolled up new characters, they started plotting. And they're like, okay, we need to find a way to combat the Super Soaker. If you were a guy like this, how would you do it? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Well, we should probably plan for guys who... Oh! Oreo! We should probably plan for guys who are wearing suits. And so they're like, okay. So they start basically loading out half and half. So they're like, okay, in the event we got to go back to conventional weapons at some point. We got to get machine guns, and so they started getting guys with machine guns. And I think one guy like rigged up a flamethrower. But I also really started cracking down since the paramedic and the police character were killed in the engagement. They were like, their source for drugs was cut off. So I was like, I told the guys, you can't do that again. I'm not gonna let you. You were clever the first time, but I'm not gonna let you pull a repeat of this crap where you have ready-made sources of drugs. And so they're like, okay, fine. So the guy made like a mechanic, and what he did was he made a guy with like he took the chemistry skill for some reason. It was some kind of chemistry thing, and he started coming up with he started doing research on his own for like medical compounds you can make at home. So just like really simple stuff. Like I want to say he just I want to say he just mixed like DMSO with Drano, but at the time he came up with something actually really clever. He started making essentially pharmaceuticals at home. You know, he started making like meth at home. So he was like, I'm a drug dealer. I deal this shit and I make it. And so he started making these chemical just masterpieces of you know, the cyberpunk equivalent of PSP or sorry PCP, and so it was that was the kind of time when they were injecting stuff with like illegal drugs. So all of a sudden they were getting super soaked with like skin absorbing cocaine, just ridiculous amounts of cocaine. And so I think that was when I started introducing the dogs, and the I started doing super soaker drones. I had little RC cars that had like tanks on them that had super soaker, because all of a sudden I started going like, why would I have guys in rubber suits? Why don't I just have little like RC cars running around with sprinkler heads, right? So like I basically installed sprinkler systems on RC cars and had them drive around with little sprinklers with DMSO and the most heinous shit possible in there. So that was sick. They didn't like that. But the thing, all of a sudden, this had become a war. This was a full-blown war now, where there was no negotiation with this crap, really. You know, like with a bullet wound, in Shadowrun with a bullet wound, you could go call an ambulance and get better. You know, there was healing. You could staple that shit shut. You could recover from that. These squirt guns, if you got squirted, you were dead. You were virtually dead. You were knocked out, at least. You know, at the very least, you were neurostunned and your shit was fucked up. You know, and you probably weren't going to be any good in the fight anyway. So it kind of broke all the rules, because all of a sudden, either you were basically dead, or you were so useless in the fight, it was one hit, you were useless. Now, again, I have to preface this by saying, I'm sure some of the guys who played Shadowrun in the past, I'm sure some of the guys who know the rules a little better than we did at the time, because again, I was like 14 or 15. We probably didn't have the rules all that right, and I'm sure there were other ways around this, and I'm sure that we did this wrong. I'm absolutely certain we did this wrong by making the drugs too available, or DMSO being available in such large quantities, or the range, or whatever. I'm sure that whatever the application of it was wrong, but at the time, I'm just telling you what the situation was at the time. This is how we were playing it. So it was just heinous, because it was basically one-hit kills, or one-hit knockouts. So all of a sudden characters were dropping like flies. People were dying left and right. It was crazy. So the characters took it, I mean, I took it personally, because they were ruining my games, and I was begging them not to. I was like, please, can we just not do the squirt gun thing? But they loved the squirt guns. So I was like, okay, motherfuckers, you want to play? Let's play. Let's get nuts. So I did this thing. I start making characters, and I start killing their characters, and then they start making characters as revenge characters. And you know those are the best kind of characters, are revenge characters, where it's a character specifically made to fuck with what the DM just did to you. You know, or that's when the adepts start coming out, you know, or characters who are somehow immune to drugs, or like have super livers that are immune to, they're resistant to drugs or intoxication or something like that. And they start experimenting with new drugs, or they start experimenting with ways to get through the suit. They found a way to get through the suit. Fuck, what was it? They kind of had like a 1-2 impact effect, where they would like, they started arguing that like if they threw a flechette grenade, or something like that, if they threw some kind of weapon that would poke holes in the suit, it would be useless to the squirt gun. So they kind of had a 1-2 punch. They were getting really or really ingenious with this thing, and they were arguing. They were like these vehement, like this would totally get through the suit. I'm sorry if this is getting distracting. It's distracting to me, but I kind of applauded their ingenuity and their willingness to keep on with this thing, because they loved it. They really loved it good. And so it became a war of escalation, where, ooh, that had to hurt. They would come up with one thing, would come up with another thing, and all of a sudden we had like large-scale squirt gun wars. All of a sudden I was finding ways to circumvent the squirt gun. I was starting to assault snipers. There were RC cars with fucking sprinkler heads on them. What else did I do? No, I did something with the sprinkler system. I started rigging the corporate guy started rigging the security system. The fire sprinkler system. They would mix it with water and DMSO. So if they started blowing holes in the shit, if there was an alarm that went off, the sprinklers would go off and they would be sprayed with DMSO, and then they would have guys like throwing chemical grenades. You know, all of a sudden we had water balloons. Really. We got to the point where not only did we have squirt guns, we had fucking water balloons. They were grenades, but they fired chemicals. So I mean, the way I've explained it, it might seem like, oh, this is a logical step, one after the other. But eventually we got to this point where we stepped back. We're in this huge scale warfare. There's RC cars that are sprinkling. There's guys lobbing water balloons. As I recall, there was a guy who wanted to design like a syringe gun. And he was like, like, fuck the DMSO, I'm gonna shoot syringes like in Team Fortress 2, you know. We've got this guy who can shoot needles. And I'm like, it wouldn't work. And he's like, what do you mean it wouldn't work? We got fuckers just arguing this shit. I remember there was a guy who, he wanted to design cyberware where he was like the Scarecrow, where he actually had he had super soakers installed in his arms. He was like Spider-Man, kind of like Spider-Man, where he had or instead of organic web shooters, he had like pressurized tanks of this shit in his arms, and so he would he'd get patted down for weapons and stuff like that, or he would go through a security screening, and it wouldn't show up as a weapon. It would show up as some kind of it wouldn't show up as a weapon, you know. At this point, I hadn't thought of installing chemical screeners, you know, in nightclubs, or chemical screeners at airports, or stuff like that, or any kind of corporate. Would you stop fighting? So this guy would come through. There'd be like a guard at the desk, and he'd be like, "May I ask your business, please?" And he'd be like, "I'd just like you to look at my hand!" And he'd spray this guy with his hand, and the guy would die instantly. And I'm like, you asshole. They loved it. They were so fucking hyped up about this. So eventually we had this. It was so fucking goofy. I remember, we got to the point where they'd raise the alarm, and they would actually have the police come out, or corporate security would come out with a tank, and the tank had a pressurized water cannon, and what I did was I reconfigured the pressurized water cannon to fire DMSO and neurostun. So I was like, it doesn't matter if you're wearing a chemical suit, you're getting hit with a fucking fire hose spraying DMSO. And I'm like, I stepped back and I was like, this is dumb. Have we really come to this, where I have loaded a fire hose with military grade sedatives and DMSO just so it'll spray through your fucking skin? I remember another thing we used to do was they started to argue that that was where the water balloons came from. This is where the chemical grenades came from. Okay, I gotta backpedal. This is where the chemical grenades came from. This is why they did this. They started to argue. The guy started asking, as they were getting shot at with the squirt guns. He started to ask, do the suits have their own independent air source? And I go, no. So they started aiming for the vents in the mask, and that was a really hard shot. My phone's going off. Figures. This is a show full of distractions. But this gave them an idea. Once again, the wheels started turning. Hang on a second. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. The wheels started turning when I said there wasn't an independent air source for the biosuits. So they start going, that means they have to breathe outside air. So that means air is getting in through the vents. So they started shooting at the vents, and they weren't that good with it. So their first thought was, well, we need to get really good accuracy so we can shoot them in the mouth through the vents. So they started asking if they could smart link their squirt guns. to hook up to their cybernetic eyes. So they'd be really, really accurate. So they started putting laser sights on their squirt guns. And they started smart linking their squirt guns. So they all of a sudden they had fucking... It was funny. So then the guy started realizing, what if... Yeah, it was... He's like, I'm going to take a grenade. I'm going to take a grenade, and I'm going to, like, take a Ziploc bag full of, like, DMSO and this shit, zip it up, rubber band it around the grenade, and throw it. And so it wasn't really a grenade, it was like a... I almost want to say like an M80 or something like that. Some kind of... It was an explosive that made sense at the time. And so he would throw this shit and basically make a water balloon. And so when the bomb exploded, it would aerosolize the drugs. It would spray it up in the air. Okay? So they argued that by breathing in the air, they were breathing in the aerosolized drug. Okay? And so they, and so I was like, wouldn't there be filters on the suit? And they're like, but they'd come too far. And so, stop biting. I was like, there should be filters on the mask, really. And they go, oh shit, yeah, you're right. But they'd made all this stuff anyway, and so they're like, well, we gotta do something. And I'm like, you know, but seriously, at that point, why didn't you guys just get like a tear gas grenade? And they're like, yeah, good idea. So they start getting like tear gas. So all of a sudden they're like, it was really funny. That's about the end of the story. I can't remember how. I think we just kind of mutually agreed to stop the squirt gun wars because it was really dumb. You know, that's about all I got. I'm sure, seriously, in comments, I know you're going to tell me, like, oh, you were a fucking bad DM. You got the rules wrong. DMSO doesn't work this way. Drugs wouldn't work that way. It wouldn't be that fast. Stop it. And I'm like, I know. I was a bad DM back then. I was like 15. I didn't know shit. She is so hyper because I'm not paying attention to her. I'm talking to you guys. So, that's about the Shadowrun story. I'm trying to think if there was any cool follow-ups to that. Yeah, it was kind of just mutual agreement. We weren't going to use the DMSO anymore. Mainly because we were starting to like carry around flamethrower tanks of DMSO, and I was like, no, this is getting kind of silly. We're so hyper, silly puppy. She never bites except when I'm in front of the camera. She doesn't. So let me think. Any other funny Shadowrun stories I can tell you about? But I guess it's funny to me. Stop it. It's funny to me because it's so not your idea of Shadowrun. It's so not the idea you have when you think of Shadowrun. You're thinking guys with Wolverine claws. You're thinking guys who are throwing spells. You're thinking guys who have machine guns. You know, hand grenades and guys who have swords and stuff like that. You're not thinking guys who are loading up for cybercrime by loading up their super soakers. Really silly. Can I help you? No? This dog. He's unfucking believable. So, I guess that's the Shadowrun story. If you've got stories you'd like to share, post them on this web zone. And I need to go put Oreo back in her crate because she's misbehaving. Have fun, you guys, and I miss Shadowrun.